Our guest today is Harvey Oyer, and it's always hard to know where to start with introducing Harvey because he's done so many things and is known for many things. But Harvey is a member of one of Southeast Florida's earliest pioneer families, going back to the early 1870s. And he's a practicing lawyer in West Palm Beach. He's a historian. He's an archaeologist. Um, he's been a captain in the Marine Corps and an adjunct professor at both University of Miami and FAU. But these days, he's probably best known as the author of the award-winning children's series, The Adventures of Charlie Pierce, which is the story, and maybe I should say maybe thinly fictionalized, but much of it based on actual letters and diaries of his, correct me if I'm wrong, Harvey, great uncle,
That's
Charlie
correct. Yes.
Pierce, who was among the first family to arrive, and later became one of the famous Barefoot Mailmen. And the Charlie Pierce series is used in many school systems in Florida for fourth grade curriculum with Florida history, and it's published by Middle River Press. It has sold around the country and around the world. So without further ado, Harvey, I'll let you tell us about your wonderful series here.
Rodney, thank you. And thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. And I want to acknowledge that Judy and Bruce Borich are on the call, and they are Middle River Press. They're the publisher of all 5 of my books in the Adventures of Charlie Pierce series. And I think back in 2008, I called them. They had done a book for another friend of mine named Bob Ganger. And I told him I had this book idea. I have no writing experience whatsoever, at least in the children's book space, but I knew what story I wanted to tell because for years I had been speaking in schools in South Florida at the invitation of teachers. As most of you know, Florida history is required in the 4th grade in Florida, as it is in most states in the country. That's the good news, that we're still teaching our kids Florida history. The bad news was there was really no material. So these teachers would reach out to me and say, hey, I'm required to teach this. I'm not really given the resources by the state and the school district to teach it. Would you come speak to my class? Which I happily did hundreds of times. Of course, inadvertently doing market research for books that I never knew I would write someday in the future. And after every one of those, someone would say, gee, you should write a book. And probably like most of you, I put that on my to-do list in life, need to write book. And like most people, I never did it until that call to Judy and Bruce in 2008 that I really want to do this. So I knew what story I wanted to tell. And it's a story about South Florida history, but through the eyes of children. And why did I pick a children's book? I never contemplated that when I thought I'd write a book about South Florida history. I thought about sort of a coffee table style book that would look really nice and people would buy it and put it on their coffee table and never read it. And then I thought, where could the book be more impactful? And my choice is to speak to our children and grandchildren, the future leaders of Florida, and try to help them better understand not only the history, but the geography, topography, water supply, flora, fauna, all the things that make our home, South Florida, unique and special. And why do I want to do that? I want to do that so we grow a better generation of Floridians who treat our unique ecology and environment and archaeology better than, frankly, we've done it in our generation and past generations. And the best way to do that is make them fall in love with it. And I remembered the way I was taught history, which was forced memorization of dates and battles and generals. And I would remember it for the test and forget it the next day. And that didn't seem like the best way of doing it. So I thought, why don't I capture their imagination in kids their own age living out adventures in the wild jungle frontier that was Florida when my family arrived in the early 1870s. don't try to teach them history, try to captivate them in a story. And along the way, we will walk them through all of the geography, topography, place names, and events that make up Florida's history, but they really don't know they're learning it. So it's basically tricking our children and grandchildren into learning Florida history, but they're just having a good time while they're doing it. Why are they having a good time? Because it's a cool adventure story of kids their own age with the same moral decisions and dilemmas. Do I fight with my sister? Do I run away from home? Do I lie to mom and dad? And kids can identify with all of those moral dilemmas and decisions. So that's sort of the idea. And the first book in the series, they're all entitled The Adventures of Charlie Pierce, which was kind of presumptuous on our part to create that title when we wrote the first book, as if there was ever going to be a second book. But in the off chance that there might be a second book, that's what we called it. And I subtitled it The American Jungle, because when my family arrived here in real life in the early 1870s, as Rodney said, this was a wild, untamed jungle frontier. Of course, Martin County did not yet exist. Palm Beach County did not yet exist. Your Broward County did not yet exist. We were all part of Dade County, and it was mainly Seminole Indians. And the only non-Seminoles were some early settlers who came here, made a go at it, didn't work, they left, as well as some lighthouse keepers in Jupiter and on Key Biscayne. So that's the environment my family arrived in. They also arrived in a very tough time in Florida's history, which was the end of the longest war in American history, a 42-year war between the United States and the Seminole Indians. We know it as the Three Seminole Indian Wars. They didn't fight nonstop for 42 years. They'd fight for a while, stop for a while, then fight again. But it was bookended by 42 years. And you can imagine how frightening that was for a white American family, my great-great-grandparents and their 8-year-old son, Charlie, to arrive in the middle of this jungle. And our only other neighbors were Seminoles who absolutely did not want us here. But we forged a friendship with them that actually changed American history, because Charlie, if we can go back to that first slide, Ellery, that's Charlie when he was about 8 years old. And behind him is a young Seminole Indian boy named Tiger Bowlegs, who became his best friend, despite the fact that their parents didn't want them to be friends, despite the fact that their peoples were at war, despite the fact that Charlie only spoke English, Tiger only spoke the Seminole language, Miccosukee, but they learned each other's language and each other's culture, and they became friends, and it eventually caused their mothers to become friends and their fathers to become friends, and in fact, their peoples become friends. And ladies and gentlemen, the longest war in American history ended. And you can read a lot of political reasons in textbooks why it ended, but I would argue that one of the biggest reasons it ended was the friendship of two 8-year-old boys who would be third graders in the Palm Beach County public school system today. They bridged a cultural divide that American presidents and generals and tribal chiefs had been unable to bridge for 4 decades. And that in itself is a remarkable story. And all 5 of my books walk kids through history and geography, but they all have an overarching moral to them. And the overarching moral story in this first book is this cross-cultural connection of people from entirely different backgrounds that were given a prejudice that they were able to overcome and make society better. And I think that's a really powerful message to have in our schools and society today, in the broken world that we live in, very diverse, multicultural school system that we have. So that's sort of the overarching moral. Now, this book ends with something exciting for kids. A hurricane, which almost wiped our family out. It also caused a ship to be uncovered on the beach. It was a Spanish galleon that had gone down 150 years earlier that was under 10 feet of sand, and the hurricane took the sand off the beach and uncovered a shipwreck that temporarily made my family very wealthy. I'll stress temporarily. But that's really exciting for kids because it was a chest full of gold doubloons. And that's sort of the cliffhanger that we end this book with, which, by the way, sends thousands of kids out to the stretch of beach, with metal detectors and shovels, and their parents on the weekends trying to find the wreck site of the Santa Marta, which is somewhere still there south of the Jupiter Inlet, north of High Paluxo. So that did well enough to encourage me to write a second book. And you're probably wondering, how do you get these books inserted in the school system? It was total blind luck. If there are other authors listening to this, I took it back to the same teachers that had always invited me to speak at their schools, school board members that I knew in Palm Beach County, folks in the administration of the school district, and I offered it up, and they took it and they liked it. And then teachers talked to teachers, and superintendents talked to superintendents, librarians talked to librarians. Then I started getting calls from other school districts, including yours. Broward was the next one. And I was invited to speak to the Broward County librarians group. And then it got inserted in the 4th grade in Broward County, and then Miami-Dade. And it started its march all over Florida. And today, the Charlie Pierce books are either completely required or recommended reading for about half the 4th graders in Florida. That does not mean half the school districts, but because, of course, once you have Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade, you have 3 of the 11 largest school districts in America. I'd love to have it in all 67 school districts, but I don't. They are really the southern half of Florida. Charlotte, Collier, Lee, Hendry, and the farthest north is up in Marion County, where Ocala is. And most of the private schools have adopted the books as well, almost all the charter schools. And interestingly, almost the entirety of the homeschooling network, which gets bigger all the time. And there's a reason for that. Most of the homeschools are affiliated with, conservative religious-based families. And all of these books have a 5-star rating by National Homeschool Book Review for being clean and family-friendly in their content. And there's a growing number of families in Florida choosing to homeschool their kids because, frankly, they don't like the content that is in the public schools. So that's maybe my biggest growing audience. So Ellery, let's go to the next slide, which is the second book that I wrote, and subtitled The Last Egret. And this is a true story. All of these are based in fact and are true stories. But of course, I have to fictionalize certain things. I have to condense timelines. I have to create dialogue. I have no idea what these kids said to each other 140 years ago. So all of that is created. So technically they're historical fiction, but the adventures they go on are factually and historically correct. And this one was a very unfortunate incident in American history. This was the plume hunting epidemic in American history, which was feeding a fashion craze of women, not only in America, but throughout Europe as well, wanted to wear very fashionable, expensive hats that were filled with colorful bird feathers that were referred to as plumes. And this went on throughout the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century. And the feathers were not from the molten feathers that naturally fell to the ground, as I think the consumers were told at the time. In fact, birds were killed to provide feathers to this industry. And birds were killed by the millions all over the world. But overwhelmingly, folks, they were killed right here in our backyard in a place that was then known as Pehaoki, which was the Miccosukee word for what we call the Everglades today. Pehaoki in the Seminole language means grassy water, which is a darn good description of the Everglades. And why were they being killed here? Well, almost every species of migratory bird in North America comes here in the winter to breed. So why would you traipse all around North America looking for these birds if you could come to one place at one time and find all of them? Much more efficient way of slaughtering birds. That was the good news for plume bird hunters. The bad news was no white person had really explored the Everglades at this point. And a lot of these plume hunters went into the Everglades with their get rich quick idea, never to be seen or heard from again. Well, through a series of incidents, my family became aware that you could get rich doing this. And teenage Charlie thought, this is a fantastic idea. We hunt every day as a way of life. That's how we get breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's birds all the way around us. And some rich lady in Manhattan wants to pay us a lot of money to do what we do already. How could it get better? But his father, my great-great-grandfather, Papa, and Mama are their names in the book, his parents. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to slaughter God's creatures. These are bad people engaged in this business. Our family will find an honest way of earning a living. But when you're a teenage boy with adventure in your blood, that was not the right answer. So Charlie concocted an idea with his childhood friend, Tiger Bowlegs, who you can see in the canoe on the left with him, as well as two other young boys who were brothers, early pioneer settlers of what is today Lantana. Their last name was Bradley, and the boys' names were Guy and Louis Bradley. This sounded just too good of an idea to pass up. Run away from home, go on a big adventure, and get rich doing it. So they hatched this plan, which took a lot of logistics, by the way, food, supplies, weapons, ammunition, your parents not finding out, but they pulled it off. And one day they sailed out of the old inlet, which is buried somewhere in today's Singer Island, not where the Palm Beach Inlet is today. And they sailed south, and they made it as far south as the Hillsborough River Inlet in the north end of York County. And they dropped anchor in the Hillsborough River and patted themselves on the back. They had gotten away scot-free, and everything was going along great. You know, fair wind at their back, didn't ground it on a reef or a sandbar, until they open the hatch on the cabin, and who pops out but the little girl that you see on your right. That's my great-grandmother in real life. Her name was Lily Pierce. She was the first known white child ever born between Jupiter and Miami. There's a National Register of Historic Places marker on the site where she was born, which is Delray's Public Beach, across the street from the Marriott Hotel, just north of Atlantic Avenue on the east side of A1A. Well, Lily, who was sort of the ultimate tomboy, overheard the boys planning this trip. She wanted to go on the trip. She knew the boys would never let her go on the trip, so she did the next best thing. She hid and stowed away on the boat. And you can imagine how unhappy Charlie was to have his stupid little sister along on his boy's adventure. But they were stuck with her, because if they turned around and took her home, they'd probably be caught and the adventure would be over with. So they reluctantly kept her. And that's how you got 5 kids on what was called the Great Plume Bird Expedition. And they spent their first days of this actually in your backyard, hunting up and down the Cypress Creek and Lettuce Lake, perfecting their bird hunting skills, which took them a while to figure out, because if you're hunting in a bird rookery during mating season, which is when the birds have their most colorful plumage, and that should be noted, the ideal time of the year to kill a bird is in the winter, when they've grown their largest, most colorful plumage to attract a mate. So they would begin firing into these rookeries with their shotguns, only to have all the birds fly away in the other direction. So they learned how to sort of encircle it and triangulate themselves around the rookery, stop using their voices. It would scare the birds away. They began using military hand and arm signals, and they would all begin firing at once. So no matter which way a bird flew, it flew into someone's field of fire. And they killed birds of all varieties, because all the bird feathers. Can we show the next slide, Ellery? This is the back cover of the book. These are 8 birds indigenous to South Florida. All of the feathers had some value, but the most valuable one that they ideally were looking for is that white bird in the middle, called a snowy egret. And I encourage you to Google this when we're done with the Zoom call. An ounce of snowy egret feathers in the late 19th century sold for 3 times the value of an ounce of gold. So these were very valuable, and ideally that's what they were looking for. But in the beginning, they just killed everything. And Charlie and Guy and Louie were pretty happy about this. They had dollar signs in their head. But Tiger Bowlegs, the Seminole Indian, almost after the first day began to check out of this exercise, because he realized while they were getting the valuable feathers, they were leaving in their wake piles of rotting bird carcasses. And in the Seminole culture, you do not harvest more from Mother Earth than you can use. And they were not using the meat. And he started to question, is this the right thing to do? But the peer pressure of teenage boys kept him going. And my great grandmother, Lily, who was a great lover of Mother Nature and loved animals, she too started to question this. So the overarching arc of this book is about how all 5 of these kids, one by one, independently determined that what they're doing is wrong. And after the end of a 5-week bird hunting expedition that took them further down the coast, up the Miami River, into the Everglades, where they found nothing but shot out rookeries, where other plume hunters had already killed the birds. And they realized that by definition of killing adult birds during mating season in a rookery, you were not only killing the adult birds, you were leaving the newly hatched chicks or the unhatched eggs to die as well. So you were not only killing one generation of birds, so some lady in Paris or Manhattan that you don't know could wear a fancy hat, you were killing 2 generations of birds. And one by one, they all checked out of this exercise. After 5 weeks of 5 teenage kids circumnavigating the state of Florida in a wind-powered vessel, they all returned home without a scratch on them, which is very unlike today's South Florida, where my daughter cannot walk to the end of the street without me going with her. And I think that's very eye-opening for our 4th grade kids to understand what Florida used to look like in the past and how normal 9-year-olds behaved back then. They all returned home, by the way, to the punishment of their lives for running away from home. But the interesting part of this book is actually not found in the main part of the book. It's found in the postscript, where I describe what happened afterwards. And what happened changed the lives of all 5 children, and in fact changed American history, because they were all so remorseful what they had participated in. With the benefit of hindsight, they realized that they had participated in the worst man-made environmental disaster in American history. The complete extinction of several species of birds and the near extinction of a number of other species of birds, all so women far away could look fashionable and someone could get rich doing it. None of them would ever hunt a bird again. When they divided the proceeds from the sale of the feathers that they did bring home, the Seminole Indian Tiger would take none of the money. Charlie gave his share of the money to his father, Papa, which was the whole point of him going on this trip. Our family needed the money. We were broke, which was pretty easy to be back then, and could not afford to pay the property taxes to keep our family island called High Paluxo Island. And incidentally, his giving the money to Papa did save the family island for another 2 generations. 3 generations of my family lived on that island. But the remarkable story was one of those 2 Bradley brothers, Guy Bradley. And if we could go to the next slide, I want to spend a minute talking about this. Guy Bradley didn't spend his share of the money. He was so remorseful that he waited a few years until he reached adulthood, and he took his share of the money and he moved back down to where we did most of the bird killing, which was Cape Sable, in particular Flamingo, which is in the middle of Everglades National Park. And that's where they did most of the killing, because it was not only the most remote part of Florida then, it is today. And plume bird hunters had not really ventured there. And that's where they had found snowy egrets and birds by the thousands and killed birds by the thousands. And he spent his share of the money, ladies and gentlemen, buying a piece of property, building a house, and living out the remainder of his life there as a game warden, protecting birds in the very location that he had hunted them with my family just a few years earlier. And if you look closely at this real life picture of Guy Bradley, that's a badge on his chest. He was a game warden protecting these beautiful migratory birds. Unfortunately, folks, in real life, in July of 1905, Guy Bradley was shot through the throat and murdered by a plume bird poacher that he was attempting to arrest. And his death as tragic as it was, changed history forever, because his death was the headline of every newspaper in America. And for the first time in 2 decades, these wealthy ladies that were consuming the hats that led to this bird killing said, wait a second, I've been lied to all these years. I thought these were the molten feathers that naturally fell to the ground and some kind soul gathered them up and shipped them to a hat factory. And that's not true. They're killing birds so I can wear this hat. And now they're killing people so I can wear this hat. You know what? I don't need to wear a hat that badly. And they started taking their hats off, and it eventually drove the industry out of business. But America was so outraged that this innocent man, our friend and neighbor, Guy Bradley, had been murdered protecting beautiful birds, that they demanded that Congress do something about it. Well, if you go back to Congress at the turn of the 20th century, they did not legislate in the area of telling Americans they couldn't hunt. I mean, we were, rugged individualists, man taming the land. We were Americans. We had guns. We killed animals. And Congress did legislate in this area. They enacted a series of laws that eventually resulted in the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the same federal law that still protects our birds today. So that was a big first in American history. But it wasn't just Congress that felt the political pressure. We had a president in the White House who felt the same political pressure to save these beautiful birds now that Guy Bradley had been murdered. But he had a big problem. His name was Teddy Roosevelt, and he loved to go hunting. He had been on safaris in Africa and down the Amazon and plastered the walls of the White House with dead rhinoceros heads. And now his voters want him to save pretty birds in Florida. What do you do? Well, he created America's first national wildlife refuge with one stroke of his pen under his constitutional executive order authority. He created the first one. We have over 500 of those today, but the first one, which still exists, is a bird rookery in Vero Beach called Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. And that was done to placate Americans in the wake of Guy Bradley's murder. And then, of course, Roosevelt received so much fan mail for doing that he, created Yellowstone National Park and National Park Service, and he goes down in history as the greatest conservationist to ever sit in the White House. But if you read a biography of Roosevelt, one of the pivotal moments that changed him from big game hunter to greatest conservationist to ever sit in the White House was Guy Bradley's murder. And if that wasn't enough change as a result of his murder, there was a housewives club in Boston, Massachusetts that had been created in someone's living room to stop the plume hunting. And these thoughtful ladies knew the truth that birds were being killed. They told their friends and peers, don't buy these hats, they're killing birds. Their friends didn't want to hear that. Their friends wanted to look good at a party. So they didn't join the club. They kept buying hats with bird feathers until Guy Bradley was murdered. And not only did ladies stop buying hats, they started joining the Housewives Club. And that Housewives Club was called the Audubon Society. And it grew into one of the largest environmental organizations in the world. And you can Google this after our call. They give away an award every year. It's called the Guy Bradley Award, named after our friend and neighbor who lost his life as a martyr to the entire American environmental movement. So this is pretty heavy stuff, isn't it? In our first book, 2 9-year-old kids in the longest war in American history. And in the second book, these kids are part of the cause of the American environmental movement. And you're probably wondering, why do school districts make it mandatory to have kids read a book about blood and guts and killing and skinning birds and people getting murdered in the postscript? Well, it's because the moral to this is something we need our children and grandchildren to grow up and be better stewards of Earth. And it's these powerful lessons that you learn as a child. We all have them. Experiences or smells or a book that we read, a teacher that we had that we've never forgotten, that it is emblazoned in our soul forever. And that's what I meant for these books to be. So powerful in the lessons that they teach, that when our kids grow up and become mayors and state legislators and governors and just plain old voters, that they do a far better job of caring for the great state of Florida than we've done, because we did not have these powerful lessons when we were in the 4th grade. Next slide, please. So the next book that I wrote is called The Last Calusa. I'm not going to talk as much about these next 3 books, but Calusas, if you don't know who they were pre-Columbian Native Americans. They were the people who occupied Florida the longest, probably 1,000 years, according to the archaeological record. Seminoles are not true native Floridians. They came to Florida in and around the year 1800 from Georgia and Alabama, mainly Creek Indians. The true native Floridians had names like Calusa and Hobe, as in Hope Sound, and Appalachia, as in Apalachicola, and Timucuan or Timucuan. We really don't know how it was pronounced. But the most powerful, best organized group were the Calusa. They raised armies, collected taxes, exerted their influence over the other Native Americans, traveled across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and traded on the Yucatan Peninsula, and they hand dug canals across Florida, sort of their highway network, so they could cross Florida without sailing around it. Really, ingenious engineers, kind of our version of the Aztec, the Maya, or the Inca, but because they didn't leave behind pyramids and a writing system, history forgot about them. And I didn't want history to forget about them because they're the most remarkable people to ever occupy the peninsula of Florida, and no one knows anything about them. So in 2013, we celebrated a really important anniversary, the Quin Centennial of Florida, which is a fancy word for 500th anniversary. It was the 500th anniversary of Juan Ponce de Leon, a Spanish explorer, landing here and naming this place La Florida. So he was the discoverer of Florida. Of course, he didn't discover anything. There'd been people here for 8,000 to 12,000 years that we know of, and even other Spanish people before him. But he had an important piece of paper. He had a charter from the King of Spain that allowed him to name this place and take it in the name of Spain. So he became the discoverer of Florida. Well, if you know what happened to our friend Juan Ponce de Leon, the discoverer of Florida, he encountered the Calusa on the west coast of Florida. That was in 1513. And then he sailed back to Spain, to Spain and back to Puerto Rico, where he was the governor. But he was about to lose his claim to Florida because he wasn't here doing things. So he had to come back in 1521. And I don't know why, but of all of our coastline, he went right back to the one place where the Calusa had attacked him in 1513. And unsurprisingly, they attacked him again, and they put a poison arrow through his thigh and they killed him. So if you wonder what happened to the man who named Florida, he died at the hands of the Calusa on the west coast of Florida. He actually died in Cuba from his wound on the west coast of Florida. And I wanted, on the 500th anniversary of Florida, to talk about not the Spanish, that's pretty well documented, but instead talk about the Calusa. But folks, I had a big problem. The Calusa were long gone before my family got here in 1872. So I had to make up a really big fiction in this book. And that is that Charlie and Lillian Tiger went on an expedition into the Everglades, hired by a university professor to search for new species of orchid. That part is true. They really did do that. But what is not true is while they were in the Everglades assisting this professor, that they ran into the last living Calusa Indian, 150-year-old Papat Ukali, who taught them the history, the spiritual beliefs, the cultural beliefs of the Calusa. They did not really run into him. That would have been very cool. And kids are incredibly disappointed when I go to their school and realize that Papat Ukali was not real. But what is real is the whole history of the Calusa, at least as much as we know, given that there's almost no written record. It mainly comes from one or two writings and archaeology. And I had, for this book, as I do for all of my books, outside experts review my book to make sure that at least the facts that I'm teaching the kids are correct. And I had the foremost Calusa archaeologist at the University of Florida, Bill Marquardt, review this book, just like I had the head of the National Audubon Society review the Last Egret to make sure that my descriptions of bird species, nesting patterns, mating habits, all of that is factually correct. So I tell the story of the Calusa through the eyes of this last living Calusa Indian. I think this is my best piece of writing It is not my best-selling book. The best-selling book is the Last Egret by far. It has outsold the other 4 books combined. But this one I thought was the most cleverly written book. Next slide, please. The back cover of every book is another teaching moment. The Last Egret was 8 birds indigenous to the Everglades. These are orchids indigenous to the Everglades. Next slide, please, Ellery. All of my books have these awesome maps. I really think it's the best feature of the book. And it happened by accident. When we published The American Jungle, it had no map in it. And the teachers came back and said, these are really great stories, thank you, but we can't really keep up with all these places that you're taking the reader through the book. It'd really be helpful to have a map. So we printed a bunch of maps and stuffed them into our books, but we were smart enough for all the future books and the reprints of the first book is to publish the map in the inside front cover. It takes up both pages of the inside front cover. And they're beautiful. Next slide, please. They're in color. These are all done by a teacher in the Palm Beach County Public School System. So while the illustrations on the covers of the book and the inside of the book are an illustrator from Judy and Bruce at Middle River Press, these are actually done by a school teacher. And it follows the story in the book. So the kids can geographically follow it, which I think really helps them to set the story straight in their head. Next slide, please. The 4th book is The Barefoot Mailman. Charlie grew up to be one of the Barefoot Mailmen. So did both of the Bradley brothers, Guy and Louie, before Guy was murdered. There were 9 Barefoot Mailmen in history. The Barefoot route existed for 7 years, carrying the mail from what is today Palm Beach County to what is today Miami-Dade. They would deliver the mail to William and Mary Brickell's house, which was at the mouth of the Miami River. Took them 3 days to walk there, 3 days to walk back, rest on a Sunday, start all over again. 156 miles round trip, 7,000 miles a year, really hard way to earn $600, which when they signed the contract, it was a 1-year contract. They thought it was a heck of a good deal because the lighthouse keepers only made $400 a year. They were going to get paid $600. They thought it was a great deal until the end of the year when they realized that they had walked 7,000 miles round trip, whether it was 100 degrees outside, 20 degrees outside, in the rain, in a tropical storm, carrying their own food and fresh water, their own protection from bears, panthers, alligators. And the barefoot route became obsolete when an inland road was cut between what is today Palm Beach County down to Lemon City, which is today part of Miami. And with a hack line, a mule and wagon, you could make it down in 2 days, far more efficient than walking 3 days. And then, of course, by 1896, Flagler had the railroad through to Miami, and you could get there in the same day. And this just became a little footnote in history that everyone forgot about. It was never called the Barefoot Route or the Barefoot Mailman until an author named Theodore Pratt moved to Delray Beach in the 1930s and 40s, and heard this story and decided to write a fictionalized book, which he entitled The Barefoot Mailman. So he's the one that coined the term, if you're wondering where the name Barefoot Mailman came from. And it was a New York Times bestseller. It sold over 500,000 copies in the 1940s, which is a huge number of books, particularly in that era with that American population. And Columbia Pictures made a feature film about it. And it was all based on these 9 guys trying to make a few bucks carrying the mail barefoot down the beach. And the most famous one, of course, was Ed Hamilton, the one who disappeared in the line of duty in October of 1887. He vanished off the face of the earth in York County at the Hillsborough River Inlet, never to be seen or heard from again. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries in our state's history. And Charlie was the last guy to see him, and Charlie went in search of him and got to the Hillsborough River Inlet and found his shoes, clothes, and mail bag hanging in a tree on the north side and his rowboat on the south side, and deduced that someone had used his boat, took it to the south side. The rowboat belonged to the mail carrier. So he was going to leave his clothes, shoes, and mail bag dry on the north side, swim the inlet, and get his boat, come back, get dressed, go on his way. But folks, he never made it across. The inlet was filled with alligators. It was October of 1887. We had just had a tropical storm. It washed a lot of water, debris, and alligators out of the Everglades. We had no South Florida Water Management District, no locks and levees. So all of it just got flushed out to the ocean. And he deduced that our friend Hamilton was eaten by alligators. Not only bad for Hamilton, it was bad for my Uncle Charlie, because as a favor to Hamilton, he had seconded his contract, which meant that if anything ever happened to Hamilton, Charlie, who just wanted to be a farmer on High Paluxo Island, had to be the Barefoot Mailman. So that is how my Uncle Charlie became a Barefoot Mailman. He had to fill out the remainder of the term. He did not renew the contract either. He just wanted to go back to farming. So this book was the fourth book in the series. Next slide, please. And this is the back cover, which illustrates how everyone else in America was receiving their mail at that same time period in the 1880s. And our unique feature only in Southeast Florida was the Barefoot Mailman. Other unique features that kids learn about in their history books are the Pony Express. So our barefoot mail route was to Southeast Florida what the Pony Express was to the western part of the country. Next slide, please. My fifth and final book, and it's the end of the series because it is the bookend of the pioneer era, which is what I wanted to write about. The pioneer era started with the arrival of my family, and it clearly ended with the arrival of Mr. Flagler's railroad. So this one is entitled Charlie and the Tycoon. The Tycoon is obviously Henry Morrison Flagler, and this is the story of Flagler's coming to Palm Beach, his interactions with my family and how it affected my family. And the arc in this book is really about the way it divided my family in real life, that Charlie and Mama bought into Flagler's vision. They loved civilization and hotels and stores and trains. But the other half of the family, Lily, my great grandmother, and Papa didn't like it at all. They enjoyed their quiet lifestyle in the wilderness with clean water filled with fish and oyster beds and wild deer and hog and turkey. And now with the arrival of Flagler and his railroad and his workers and his hotels, the water became polluted. The wild game ran away further into the Everglades. Life changed forever. And so I speak to this balancing act between good things, economic development and civilization, and the negative impacts that it has on our natural world and our quality of life. And I did that for a reason, because those are the identical issues that every city commission, county commission in the state of Florida struggles with every time they meet. What is the right balance between jobs for our children and economic growth and prosperity, and destroying our coral reef system, flooding half the Everglades and draining the other half, polluting our water supply? At what cost are we willing to accept the economic development? And I do this for a reason. I don't try to lead the reader to one conclusion or another. I try to tell them the pros and cons of both sides so they can begin to struggle with and weigh these issues in their own mind. So in a few short years, when they are voters and mayors and governors, that they know how to weigh and analyze these competing interests. Because if they dig all of us up 100 years from now and Florida still exists, I guarantee you the city commission in every one of our cities will be struggling with the same issue 100 years from now. So that's the story I wanted to tell here. Next slide, please. And the teaching moment on the back of this is Flagler hotels all over Florida. I didn't have a big enough back cover to put all of them, so I selected a few from different parts of Florida. And then the symbolism here of that train, you see the train full of rich people coming from the Northeast is coming just as fast as these railroad workers could lay the railroad ties for the train. And that's very symbolic of the South Florida we live in today. As fast as one of my developer clients can build a building or a housing subdivision, or just as quickly as we can put another lane on I-95, there's more people from New York, New Jersey, Venezuela, Colombia, wherever they're coming from, coming here as fast as we can build the infrastructure. And I wanted to leave them with that piece of symbolism as well. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and give a few minutes for questions before I have to run to the airport. But I want to acknowledge Don Coley on this call, who wrote the definitive book on Flagler's other big project, which was the digging of the Intercoastal Waterway, the entire length of Florida, what we today know as the Intercoastal Waterway, which was one of the greatest private engineering feats in history, probably only eclipsed by Flagler building an overseas railroad to Key West. Today, I think people falsely think that that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers. It was done by private enterprise. And that was a great contribution to the scholarship of Florida history. So thank you, Don, for writing that and for your family's history in Broward County. So I'll shut up and try to answer questions.
So if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourselves and ask, or you can type them into the chat box and I can ask for you. If you have any comments, the same goes.
Hi, Don Coley here. And Harvey, thank you for that compliment. You continue to amaze me as a storyteller and a speaker. Unless you had a good teleprompter sitting right there, you went through a lot of information very quick. But you've lived that since birth. You've lived a lot of these stories since birth, and you tell them very well. And thank you for your friendship, and thank you especially. I have to give you my own personal endorsement of your books, the Charlie series. I have enjoyed so much with the copies of a few of the books that you gave me, reading those to my grandchildren who live here, and telling those stories, and to watch my 10-year-old grandson Landon looking at that map from the first book that you talked about, and imagining where all of that happened was really cool. So congratulations on that and the service that you're providing to the state and our history and our future. Thanks.
Thank you, Don, and it's my pleasure. We all want to leave something behind, and what I want to leave behind is a better generation of Floridians. And I think it starts with teaching our children, not trying to teach us. We are sort of who we are at this age, so we have a greater opportunity to impact them. And by the way, there were not many people in Southeast Florida. So even though we lived long distances apart, Ivy Stranahan was one of my great-grandmother's best friends, as were the Brickell family in Miami. So talk about a long commute to go have a coffee or dinner with someone. It was a long commute.
Harvey, do you want to tell anyone how they can purchase your books, where they can find them?
Sure. So you can find them in most history facilities. You may have them in yours, Jupiter Lighthouse, Stranahan House. But if you want to order online, you can order actually from Rodney and Barbara. They run the fulfillment for my books. So you can go to thelastegret.com, thelastcalusa.com, adventuresofcharliepierce.com, any of the book titles.com will take you to the website where you can purchase them. And there is a sale going on where if you buy the entire package of 5 books, you save about $40, which is a big savings. And this time of year, sales are pretty brisk because we get into the holiday season and people find these to be great gifts, Christmas, Hanukkah gifts for grandchildren, because probably everyone on this call, you want to give something of meaningful value to your children and grandchildren, like a book, like teaching them history. And I encourage you to do that because they'll have a great time reading the book and do not know that you have tricked them into learning history. And I also encourage you to read it yourself. I have a lot of adult readers, people who email me and say, bought it for the grandkids, but while I was reading it, I wanted to keep a set for myself because I learned more about Florida in reading a children's book for an hour and a half than I've learned in 25 years of living here. So I encourage you to read them with your children and grandchildren.
Great. Thank you. So Harvey has to go catch a flight, but if you want to see this again, or if you want to send this to someone, you'll be able to watch it on History Fort Lauderdale's YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, type in History Fort Lauderdale, and go to our page. You'll be able to find it. If anyone has any other questions, you can contact us, or you can contact Harvey himself or Rodney if you would like to purchase a book. And we're History Fort Lauderdale. And we thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next month. Harvey, thank you
you
so
all.
very much. It was wonderful.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everyone.